Breaking news, Alireza Firouzja is back and is regaining his top form. He's playing in Bucharest at the Superbet tournament, part of the Grand Chess Tour. And in today's game, he's playing against Bogdan-Daniel Deac, who has the white pieces. Firouzja has black. I think you're going to enjoy this game. One thing Firouzja said about this game that he really liked, he said he liked that the game was complicated. Let's jump right in. White plays d4, and Firouzja responds with d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, and c6. We have a Slav defense on the board, traditionally a very solid setup. White plays e3. This is known as the slow Slav. One of the issues with this is he is blocking in his bishop on c1, but what he wants to do is prepare e4 as quickly as possible. This is a very popular way of playing this at the top level. But bishop f5 is played by black. One of the disadvantages of the slow Slav is that black is able to get his light-squared bishop outside of the pawn chain, and Firouzja does that immediately. Knight to c3, a natural developing move, and e6, and we see he has the light square barrier of the pawns, but with the light-squared bishop outside of the pawn chain. Bishop to e2, h6, and here the main move is actually bishop to d3. You actually lose a tempo with the bishop. That's the trendy move. And this game actually transposes into this. I can't pretend to say I understand why you do this. The idea ultimately is to get e4 in as quickly as possible, but it is a strange decision. But white actually castles here, and after knight b to d7, then plays bishop to d3. Bishop takes and queen takes. And again, the idea is white wants to play e4 as soon as they can, but it really seems to be a strange decision to give up your good bishop and lose a tempo in the process. Bishop to b4, hitting the knight on c3, and restraining the move e4. Can't play e4 right now because of bishop takes knight. Bishop to d2, and now the bishop goes to a5. And here, Deac plays a move against Firouzja that has only been played once before. It's a very creative move, and I think it might even be the computer's top choice. That's b4. It looks strange. It looks like he's just hanging a pawn, but it isn't really, because if bishop takes pawn, then knight takes d5 as an intermezzo works for white. If bishop takes d2, then knight f6 was with check, knight f6, queen d2. And white has, I mean, it's even material, but white has some nice queenside play, a4, rook f to b1, and he's doing well there. And if instead of that, if knight takes d5, then just pawn takes knight, and when bishop takes d2, dc6, and you are threatening the knight with check, and that allows white to have a good position. Still even material, but he can just work on these weak pawns on the A and the C file. So Firouzja instead plays the bishop to c7, but it's on a nice diagonal, aiming at white's king. And now b5 was played. e4 immediately, which is kind of the original concept of this opening, has been played before, and is also a good approach. Firouzja thought this was better for white. Computers see no difference, but e4 is a natural move. Deac plays b5. Basically, it's like a minority attack, even though you don't have a pawn minority yet. You're attacking this c6 pawn, trying to create a weakness on the c5 square as quickly as possible. Firouzja plays knight to b6, immediately aiming at this c4 weak square. And if c5 is the response, then I can jump into c4, and black is doing fine here. The knight's well placed on that square. So instead, Deac takes on c6, and Firouzja does not retake, which is fine, but instead plays dc4, a more aggressive idea, hitting the queen, forcing it to move, and now bc6. So black is up a pawn here. He also has nice control of a lot of key light squares in the position. The downside, of course, is that he now has 3 isolated pawns, so he's going to have to use piece activity to compensate for some of those pawn weaknesses. Knight to a4 is played, aiming at this nice c5 square, a great landing spot for a knight. Castles, rook a to c1. By the way, if he just takes on b6, you don't want to do that. You just open up the a file. But rook a to c1, Deac wants to basically capture this pawn after knight b2, knight c4. Queen to d5 was played. Again, queen to e7 controls this key diagonal. Queen to d5, though, hits these light squares and also prepares maybe a future shift of the queen over to the king side. But bishop to b4, queen's not on e7, so it can get on this nice active diagonal. Aiming at the rook, rook goes to b8, knight to b2, aiming at the c4 pawn, and now a5, gaining space, and hitting this bishop on a3, making it a little more vulnerable on the, the bishop's on b4. It goes to a3, making it a little bit more vulnerable on that square. And here Firouzja plays a really strong move, c3. The idea is that if queen takes c3, queen takes a2, and now this a pawn is passed and is very, very powerful. So instead, knight to d3 was played, which is a very good move, the best move, I think, in the position. Knight to e4, and now knight to c5, directly challenging the knight on e4. Now, this next move by Alireza was a move that he thought was one of the stronger moves in the game, a way of really keeping his activity going. He plays the move knight to d2. And this, of course, distracts this knight on f3 away from the defense of the king. Knight takes, which is forced, cd2, queen d2, and now e5 is played, trying to take advantage of this pin down the d file. But that does allow white to play this fairly strong move here, e4, pushing the queen back. The queen goes to d8. The queen can take on d4, but then after, say, queen d4, e4, rook fd1, white is doing fine, and black still has the pawn weaknesses. So instead, to keep complications, Firouzja plays the queen to d8 and also prepares it perhaps to come over here to the king's side. Rook f to d1, backing that up. e4, queen d4. And here Firouzja plays something you might want to call a high-level bluff in a way. He plays the move bishop to f4. But his opponent was actually low on time. He had, maybe 12 minutes to hit the 40 move mark, and this is that was move 26. And white does have a strong reply here, but it's very hard to see. The strong reply is queen to c3, which unblocks this rook, and now the rook aims at the queen. Of course, the rook on c1 is threatened by the bishop, but you have to attend to the threat to the queen first. After queen g5, rook to b1, white is doing well, containing black's play, and still has the weaknesses on the A and C file to work on. But that's a very hard move to see in time pressure. So instead, he plays a more natural move, which is rook to c2, just moving the rook away from the threat of the bishop. And now queen to g5. And black is threatening rook to d8, causing all kinds of trouble on the d file. So the rook moves to f1 to prevent that threat. And also, he prepares to expand on the king side with g3 and f4. It puts the rook behind the f-pawn. Firouzja does play rook to d8, obviously immediately attacking this queen. The queen goes to c3, and now queen to h5, threatening, obviously, queen h2 mate. He knows that's not going to be allowed, of course. But instead, white plays the more natural move g3. The bishop moves to e5, aiming at the queen. Queen to b3, attacking the knight on b6. And now knight to c8. Rook a to b8 also was acceptable, of course. Perfectly good move. And here, bishop to c1 was played. Computers like king to g2, just kind of keeping any pieces outside of these light squares. But bishop to c1 was played, preparing perhaps a later f4 with the bishop. Really, the bishop probably is going to e3 to control this d4 square, so black's bishop cannot land on it, is the idea. Rook to b8, hits the queen on b3. And here, the move queen to e3 turns out was best so that white can stay in contact with the bishop on c1. If bishop to d4, which looks natural, then queen to a3, the queen stays in contact with the bishop, and now black's own bishop blocks this d file. So this would have actually been equal. But instead, white plays the queen to a4. And here, black had a strong idea. Firouzja could have played rook to b5, was very strong, and after, say, king to g2, rook to d4, hits the queen, and the queen really has only one square to go to, and that's a3. It has no other place to move. After queen a3, bishop to d6, doesn't trap, it pins the knight on c5, and the best variation for white after this move is bishop to e3, but after exchanges on d5, you get this endgame where black is much better. The two minor pieces versus the rook, but the real winner for black is this passed c-pawn, and it can advance fairly quickly. So that would have been a good move for Firouzja, but he instead plays rook to d1. He wants to get at the king. He doesn't want to win that endgame with the c-pawn. He wants to get at the king, so he plays rook to d1, offering the exchange of rook so he can get in there and cause all kinds of trouble. If rook to d1, queen d1 check, king g2, however, white does look to be okay in this position. And instead, he plays rook to d2. But that allows rook takes f1. And after king f1, black can actually just take the pawn on h2. He doesn't take it just yet, believe it or not. But after rook d8, king h7, black is better here. But one principle you see grandmasters following is get all of your pieces into the attack. So he actually takes this opportunity to play knight to b6. He gains a tempo against the queen at a4, and he knows this h2 pawn isn't going anywhere. So he's getting his pieces active before he grabs the pawn. Queen takes c6. If queen d1, queen h2, queen f3 was probably a better defense, but black is still better here. But he goes ahead and takes the pawn on c6, queen h2, knight to d3, hitting the bishop, queen to h1 check, king e2, and here a very powerful move, a move that really makes it all come together for Firouzja, bishop to d4. And he's like building a construction, brick upon brick. The bishop defends the knight controls the c8 square, which allows the rook to go to c8, skewering the queen and attacking the bishop on c1. It's a whole big kind of structure. Bishop defends knight, knight defends c8, rook attacks queen, hits the bishop. A really beautiful construction of pieces. Rook to d1 counterattacks the queen, but the queen goes to h5 with check. King to e1, and if he blocks with f3, by the way, just queen h2, and he's all in the position. He ends up grabbing the g3 pawn with check. That would be the end of it. So f3 does not work. The king goes to e1. Rook to c8, as we just mentioned, controlling the c file, queen to b7, and queen to f3. And in this position, basically a form of Zugzwang, white resigned and Firouzja got his victory. The threat basically is to come to rook to c2 with threats of mate on e2. If the rook tries to interpose, just bishop c3 would pin. Or rook e8 takes e4 check. Those two threats of rook e8 takes e4 and rook c2 are basically unstoppable. He'll have to pick his poison if bishop d2, for example, just rook e8. And the game would be over. So Alireza Firouzja regaining his old form back, it looks like. A very nice win today. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.